Episode 172, What a Pandemic Can Teach You About Your Contracts. This Week in Weddings is a support group for wedding industry entrepreneurs.
We're the ones behind the scenes, planning and designing the event, arranging the flowers, creating the invitations, or taking the photographs for a couple's most important day ever. No pressure.
If you've been in the wedding industry for more than a minute, you know it's not all cake and confetti. Running a wedding business is hard, and it's certainly not for the faint of heart.
This Week in Weddings is where we catch up on this often crazy but amazing industry and share tips on how to be a better business owner, all while supporting each other along the way.
You're listening to This Week in Weddings with Kimberly Rhodes and Annie Roach. Hi guys, I'm Kimberly Rhodes, owner of Hitched Events.
And I'm Annie Roach, owner of 5x7 Designs.
Annie, should we tell everyone our exciting news?
We have breaking news.
Breaking news. Okay, so honestly, this started because we've gotten so many questions over the years about podcasting, what equipment we use, how we do it, all of the things.
And we thought, this is some insider information that, it's taken us a while to figure it out and some trial and error. And we thought, let's get all this information together and put it in a course and teach the world.
I am so excited about this. We are launching a course called So You Want to Start a Podcast. And it is literally all of our knowledge from almost 4 years of doing this now. And I'm super excited about this.
Yeah. Kimberly, can you imagine taking this course before we started our podcast? I mean, we
feel like it would have helped a lot.
I know. A lot of less sleepless nights and a lot of less frustration on our end if we could have taken our own course.
Yep. I mean, honestly, as many people, I think even like during this downtime, people are like, maybe I'll start a podcast. Like, I feel like anytime I go to a conference or used to go to conferences, it's like podcast is the new thing. So if you're in that boat where you've been thinking about it at all, like this is the time to maybe take some action. So if you've been thinking about it, this course will get you on the right track from beginning to end. And right now we're doing a pre-launch. So the actual course will launch on August 5th. But if you buy today through August 5th before it actually goes live, you get a discount. Annie, tell them what they'll save.
Act now, guys. And for the pre-launch, we are giving $50 off. So that is some big savings. I feel like that's kind of a big deal. So
that's a really big deal.
Act now. And you might get a set of steak knives too. Just kidding.
But probably not. You can go to thisweekinweddings.com/courses for the information on the pre-launch. It's just a couple weeks away from when it actually goes live, but you can buy now, save a little bit of money, and as soon as the course goes live, you'll have access to all the videos. There's tutorials, all kinds of things.
No, I mean, I'm excited about it to take it myself because I do, we all have our specific roles, but I'm like, ooh, I really want to kind of learn what Kimberly does. And Kimberly can learn what I do. So, now if we ever, drop dead or want to find another host, we've got it all organized here in one place.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay. Don't forget thisweekinweddings.com/courses. Get you into the pre-launch before August 5th. You will save $50. Do it now. Welcome back to the podcast. Annie, have you had to redo your contracts with this pandemic situation?
I haven't yet because I'm not sending that many contracts out, unfortunately.
I know, it's the truth.
A lot of my contracts were done pre-COVID, so I'm like in the middle of those.
Yeah.
And I'm actually starting to send, a few. So I do need to update them. So this is great timing.
So my contract before was actually pretty good in terms of like postponements and cancellations. Like that was all detailed out, and force majeure, like that was all in my contract. But I did not have until recently addendums created for like postponements and for cancellations. So I just recently had to get those because that's not something I had before.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'm thinking about with my contract, I mainly lay out my paying structure, which is I do, 50% deposit to start design, and then I usually do the remaining balance at printing. Well, now because I'm a lot of times it's going to be a year before I'm printing some things that I kind
Oh,
of need
want to
that
change out
cash.
your
Yeah, I think I'm
payment
going to do.
schedule?
Yeah, I think I'm going to do my to break it in to threes now instead of 50/50
Yeah, that's good. That
to get
makes a
more
lot of
cash
sense.
flow. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and what's interesting is with weddings that we had to postpone, and then I had one that actually canceled. I was looking at a lot of vendors' contracts more carefully as far as like, what do we still owe? And, and it's interesting because I feel like vendors are kind of all across the board where some are very much had in their contract, like, even if you cancel, you owe us in full, like bands in particular, and
Mm-hmm.
some photographers had that too. And then some were just like, you only lose your deposit. And so I feel like some vendors kind of got screwed a little bit because they just didn't have the language in their contract about what they're still owed in
Yeah.
terms of a cancellation or postponement. Anyway, this will be a good episode because we are talking all about contracts. What's so interesting is we did, gosh, what was that, like episode 2 or something? We had a contract episode like years ago, but that was like before even thinking about the world and pandemics and how they might be affected. So here we are
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. It's funny how we're having to modify our lives with this, but there's a new normal and you got to adapt to that.
That is true. Well, our guest is Wynne Reese, who is a attorney based out of Minnesota, but she also has a division of her business that is specifically for creative businesses. So we thought she would be a perfect person to come on. I know sometimes like attorneys don't understand our jobs
Yeah.
because they're so specific, but
Mm-hmm.
that's not the case with Wynne.
Good.
In less than 4 years, Wynne started 2 successful businesses, and at just 30 years old, she successfully sold one of them to devote her energy to a legal niche, the creatives Counsel. The business she sold, a wedding planning company. Yes, this lawyer was a wedding planner first and foremost, with floral design as a talent as well. If you ask her, she may entertain dabbling here and there, and she still gets her fill of the industry by officiating weddings.
The Creatives Council focuses on supporting business owners by offering them affordable and approachable legal work with counsel they can relate to. Reese Law LLC was founded in 2013, and to date, Wynne has worked with over 750 businesses in an outside counsel capacity, as well as quite a few more individuals. All this time, she continues to organize and partake in philanthropic ventures in her community, complete over 150 pro bono hours per year, including founding a pro bono legal clinic in North Minneapolis, and serve on a number of committees and boards. You will often find Wynne speaking at events in support of other business owners or missions that are important to Reese Law, such as entrepreneurship, community development, anti-bullying, and equality. In her free time, you can find her on some adventure with her husband, son, and 2 golden doodles, catching a fitness class, traveling to a wonderful place, cozying up by the fire with a cribbage board and a glass of whiskey, or catching up on the latest episodes of her favorite shows.
Let's welcome to the show Wynne Reese.
Welcome, Wynne. We're so excited to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you guys so much.
I mean, super exciting topics of contracts, but something everybody needs right now for sure.
It certainly is. It is less scintillating than planning a beautiful wedding, but it's the background side of it, so it's important to touch on.
Exactly. Well, before we dive in and talk about contracts specifically as they relate to pandemics and cancellations and postponements and all of that, tell us a little bit about your background, being a past wedding planner and an attorney. Kind of give us that whole story, and then we'll dive right in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a wedding planner in a former life. I planned my first wedding when I was 18, and I was just kind of always the friend, as I'm sure many of us were, who was always relied upon to plan an event, to find the decor, to source a good eatery. And it was always just a passion of mine. And I didn't actually turn it into like a true legal business until I was waiting for my bar results. And I had a really strange bar exam experience where, first of all, I'm a terrible test taker. I'm very honest about that, horrible. And you walk into the bar exam and it's this like massive convention center. And they have you go through metal detectors and then sit every 3 people. Now it'll probably be every 10 people. And, you have like one clear baggie and you have your computer and it's 2 8-hour days back to back. Can't talk, can't get up unless you have to go to the bathroom.
Sounds so much
kind of watching you.
fun. Sounds like
Yeah,
a
it's
blast.
brutal. It's brutal. And so the first morning of the bar exam, a girl sitting 3 people down from me due to the stress had a grand mal seizure, and they let her seize for 7 minutes before stopping the test.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, it was. I mean, I'm sitting there thinking like, I can't get up because I'll fail, but I really want to help her. So anyway, I walked out of this exam thinking, okay, there's a really good chance I didn't pass. And so when I talked to my parents about if that was the case, they brought up the idea of why not turn your wedding planning business into a real thing and do that as a backup plan. So I did. I spent the 3 months waiting for the results to build out a wedding planning business, book out 17 events for the next year, and then I passed. So for the first few years, I was like true Gemini, lawyer one side, wedding planner on the other.
Interesting. Wow. That is crazy. Okay, so then when did you make like the real transition?
Mm-hmm. So it kind of started when I got engaged, and I was like, okay, like if I'm going to see my soon-to-be husband ever, I can't run 2 businesses because lawyering, right, is all during the week, and then planning is so often on the weekends. And so at that point, I just kind of decided I think I either need to shut down or sell. I ultimately did sell. But I miss it. You know, I miss being in the industry, but working with so many people in the industry, I still get to kind of dabble here and there. And I always tell my friends if they need extra hands on site that I'm welcome to, that I would be happily come and help them out. So.
Well, you're not missing much right now, Wynne.
Just so you crickets. Yeah.
So we are talking about contracts and specifically about the pandemic and what changes people need to make. And I know I had a couple of postponements from the spring events that we moved to later in the year, and even a cancellation. And so I feel like I was looking at a lot of different vendor contracts for their language on postponements and cancellations. And I feel like as an industry, we're kind of all over the place on those sorts of things. I don't know if you're seeing that too, but that's kind of how I felt.
I am seeing that. I am seeing all sorts of things in documents. I'm seeing all sorts of approaches to client cancellation or client request for rescheduling. And it is, you know, we're in an unprecedented time. And so, you know, we're dealing with the situation of a lot of contracts don't actually address what's going to happen. And a lot of people don't emotionally know how to handle it or from a business perspective. So there aren't really industry standards in place yet.
Yeah. So when just like big question to start, like what are some of the biggest mistakes you see people making when it comes to their contracts? And I guess specifically at this time that their contract is not protecting them from.
Yeah. So I think, you know, and I took some notes here. So that's what I'm referencing over here. But, you know, as I said, we are in completely unprecedented times. And what that means from a legal perspective is there's not much to look back on to use as a basis for an argument. I actually
can't cite the swine. I mean the Spanish flu of 1918 contract.
It's tough. It is tough. You know, the 1918 is a bit long ago. But I actually did talk to a mentor of mine who's a recently retired member of the judiciary to ask kind of what would happen from a judge's perspective. And they, interestingly enough, did mention that if they were looking for something to base it on, they would probably look at the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So that's, you know, it's in our lifetime. And if people want to do their own research, they're welcome to kind of look into that. But, you know, I think, you know, and I, as I mentioned to you guys, you know, the word mistake, I always like worry a little bit because, you know, this hasn't happened before. And so I don't want to say that the absence of something is a mistake just because, you know, so often, and maybe this is kind of the area of room to grow, but so often when vendors are writing their contracts for the first time, and they're, you know, working with attorneys, they will understandably want as short of documents as possible because they fear that a longer document is going to be a deterrent to a client and that they're going to lose a potential client to a vendor with a shorter, more, quote, friendly contract. And, it is true that there are a fair amount of things that need to go into a contract that bulk it up a bit. And if you want a one-page document, you can have one, but it's probably just not going to be as effective as, say, a 4 or 6-page document. And so I do think that is an area of growth, is acknowledging that probably moving forward, having a longer contract is probably going to work to your benefit, only because you can get more in there and really address the issues you need to.
And what's funny is I even see vendors who don't necessarily have a formal contract. Like I feel like hair and makeup artists notoriously just have like, here's the quote and just like sign the agreement. And there might be a few sentences about some like policies.
Yeah.
But very rarely do I see a formal like contract.
That's so true. And we see also a lot of documents that have been purchased from these various websites that sell forms, like contract forms to vendors. And those are usually a little bit shorter than, a drafted contract specifically for you. But the problem there too is that they're written so generally that, you'll see right on there in their disclaimer language that, that they aren't legal advice. They shouldn't be taken as legal advice, that they need to be reviewed by an attorney for state compliance. And that's really because even if the person who is selling them is a lawyer by education or degree, they aren't selling them as a lawyer, because that would pose some real issues with our professional rules of responsibility as lawyers. And so that's where you're kind of running into this issue where a lot of people will just go ahead and buy a form online or look at another person's form and download it or copy it or whatever it is, and they don't really understand what it means, and it doesn't address their preferences. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of issues come up, is that short documents and lack of understanding of tailoring the documents to what they would like to see happen in a situation like this.
And I mean, I'll just be perfectly honest. My contract is long, but when this all happened, I honestly had to go back and read it and go, what is my postponement policy? Like, I'm not even really sure because I mean, I started my business 9 years ago. That's when my contract was drafted. At that point with 0 clients, I kind of was like, yeah, go ahead and put in a postponement. I like just wasn't thinking about it as a legit thing that could happen until it happened. And then I had to go review it and be like, am I getting screwed by this or not? Because I hadn't read it in years,
Yeah, absolutely. And that is something, I really do encourage all of the clients who we work with, we encourage them to do an annual or every 2 years kind of update or just review of their contract, or we just hop on a call and make sure that they still understand it, or if any client issues have arisen, that those are addressed in there. Because as much as you try to make them as friendly as possible, there is still legal language in there. And it's jargony. It's not easy for people to just readily understand.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So specifically when it comes to like this pandemic and postponements and cancellations, I'm curious to get your thoughts on some like contract information that we should all be considering in light of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So where to dive in? So I have your questions. So you guys asked great questions, sent me some great questions. So I kind of have them outlined a little bit here. So, force majeure, we'll get into that under kind of this best protect yourself, as well as, kind of some of the cancellation and rescheduling. So I think if you're thinking about how, let's see here, how postponement and cancellation clauses can be written to protect wedding pros. Here, I think you want to really think through what you want to have happen. And then you have to think through what will reasonably happen if a dispute were to occur. If you're working with an attorney, they can help you. But you want to think about what can reasonably be upheld, yes, in the eyes of the court, right? If it were to end up in in court for whatever reason, but also in the eyes of public opinion. Given how much word of mouth matters for the wedding industry, and people's accessibility to news sources lately. I mean, the number of, threats coming across from clients saying, I'm going to go to the news. I'm going to go on Facebook. I'm going to go on Instagram, and tell everybody what you're doing. You really want to think through kind of what's happening there. I mean, ultimately, it will be whatever your client will agree to do. But I always suggest when you're starting out and you're writing those, think about it, from a lawyer perspective, meaning what is the absolute worst thing that can ever happen? Okay, we have a, rogue mother of the bride who decides to go to every local news station and Facebook and Instagram, and your contract is pasted everywhere, as are your emails. And in that situation, think about what would all of the normal people, the non-wedding industry people, what would they think if they saw this? And so, there's a lot of different options, and we can kind of get into those further, but I really, really encourage people to think about, yes, wedding industry, but also the outside, because we know, that one newspaper article, a few bad reviews, it can take down a business, or it can seriously harm them. And the whole defamation and slander argument, if it's based in fact, that's tough to win. And so, you really want to make sure that you feel confident about what you're saying. Also, I will say throughout your contract, if there are different clauses that you feel strongly about or that are pivotal, especially during this time, which would be your cancellation, your rescheduling, your force majeure, your other COVID-related policies. There's a number of clauses that you add to your contract right now because of COVID. I would actually put in a little initial line under each one of those clauses so that they have to literally initial by that clause, because it makes it harder for them to argue, well, it was buried in the contract, I didn't read it. So I would encourage that.
When I have a quick question, because I do invitations. So I've been lucky where most of my my contracts were basically pre-COVID, and they're just postponed, and no one is really questioning that. We're just going to print at a later date. Yes, it sucks for cash flow, but the contract will be done out, and the items will be produced. Is COVID? Is it this protected under an act of God in your contract, or is it a total different thing we're finding out?
So it's a little bit of a different thing. Okay, so force majeure or act of God, or sometimes it's called responsibility clause. It's one of the most common clauses in many contracts because it is kind of one of those legal jargon clauses that gets thrown in. Well, unbeknownst to most people, this type of clause, although it's been in documents for many decades, the principal purpose of the clause historically has been to protect a party from getting sued if they cannot perform because of an unexpected event that prevents the party through no fault of that party, not allowing them to keep money if they cannot perform and protecting them from liability if they cannot perform. So yes, it could protect you. However, one of the biggest kind of trends I've seen in the industry because of cash flow, I think in particular, and this idea of lost potential future opportunity is, we know that we can't perform now and we should be released from liability for that. But, we want you to reschedule. And if you won't reschedule, you're going to lose all your money, including your non-refundable deposit. And if you do reschedule, then you have to pay a rescheduling fee, and you have to do it on a certain, within certain months on a certain day of the week in the future. And that is where we run into some issues as to how courts would find that. So the standard force majeure should, depending on how it's written, it should protect your company from liability because you cannot perform the contract. However, the standard force majeure is not going to allow those other things.
So I'm kind of dumb when it comes to this. Okay, so a force majeure part of your contract basically is saying circumstances beyond my control are making it so I can't fulfill this contract. Is that true statement? Okay. So
Yeah.
then let's just pretend, let's just say you're a venue. Let's say you're an event venue and you are not able to hold this person's wedding because of a pandemic. Does the venue automatically owe the client back all of their money? Period? Or is it just dependent on how the contract is written?
So it's pretty dependent on how the contract is written. However, for various attorneys who I've spoken with, as well as members, retired members of the judiciary, most are saying that they would believe that if it were to end up in court, the money would have to be returned, even the non-refundable deposit, because it's kind of like, it's kind of like saying, okay, I am going to buy this new car. I put $5,000 down payment on this car, and I'm going to pick it up in 3 weeks when I'm ready for it. In that 3-week time period, there's a hailstorm. The car is destroyed. They can no longer give me the car, but I would not want them to keep my $5,000 if I'm not getting the car. So it's kind of, it's one of those situations. Now, one kind of thing that we do believe would happen is if it were to end up in court, that a judge would say, vendor, you can keep the money that you can show that you've already earned. So if you can say, you've already done 13 hours of planning or 13 hours of design, that you can keep that money at either your hourly consulting rate or an industry standard reasonable hourly consulting rate. We do believe that that is something that would happen in the instance of most judges looking at the equity of a situation. And so I really encourage our clients, before just kind of jumping into, small claims court, trying to negotiate with their client and saying, we believe that we can uphold our contract. We believe that we can execute our contract. However, we understand things are going on right now. We understand there's hardship and there's stressors. We're willing to come to a resolution with you where, we are refunding the money that you're demanding that we refund, but less the amount that we've already earned.
Yeah, I think this is where it gets so challenging because, as a planner, as I'm sure you know, I've been in the middle of many discussions between the client and the vendor, and this is what the vendor's contract says, and the client is like, but I can't have my event, so why would I pay the deposit? And it's that hard, I get it. The vendor has lost a date and has lost the income and has been holding a date for who knows how long. And the client's like, but I was buying something I'm not getting. Why am I paying money for something I'm not getting? That has been a hard conversation for me to have because I understand both sides 100%. I get, you've been holding this date for a year. And
totally.
clients not having they haven't done anything. If it's a photographer, let's just say, or a videographer, they haven't given me anything. They've just, they haven't done anything.
Right. And that's where you run into the issue where it's kind of like in a normal circumstance, the non-refundable is meant to protect against, let's say, the couple breaking up. And in that instance, that photographer would have been able to have another wedding on that date. But in this instance, when it comes to, the cancellation, it's unlikely that the vendor would have been able to perform for any other couple on that date. And so there isn't really, it takes a little wind out of the sails of the loss of opportunity argument. And there is the argument that keeps being said, well, if you're rescheduling, you have to pay me this fee because, I'm going to lose a potential date next year to somebody that I could have booked for somebody else. But the response there, from what I have seen so far, has been, you're not guaranteeing that you're losing any work in the future because you don't have that work yet to be lost. And even if you notoriously or historically have booked dates weddings on that date for the last 3 years. Yes, it's unfortunate that there is that future loss of date. However, that future loss is every other business in the world's current loss. And so that is where kind of the equitable side of things starts to come into to the argument, I think. And it is really tough because having been a vendor, I absolutely see the vendor side of it. And I know how much work goes in on the front end, even photographers, dreaming about the day, thinking about shot lists, thinking about lighting, looking at inspiration.
Well, just all the hours built up to booking that client.
Completely. And, the kind of like unsung elephant in the room, as a small business, probably a strong majority of the wedding industry and events industry, they don't have the liquidity to just start refunding everybody.
Right.
If they all of a sudden have 10 people saying we want our money back, and they all took, $2,000 deposits, that's $20,000 that they need to pay out. That's not something that most small businesses have sitting in the bank.
Right.
And so it puts in a really tough situation. And that's where I think coming to the force majeure, and then, your cancellation and rescheduling, and thinking about what you want. And if the goal really is to retain the money, rewriting your force majeure clauses so that you're allowed to, in the instance of force majeure or a resurgence of COVID, which will absolutely happen, it's already happening in many places, Texas one of them, that you have Shoot.
True story.
That you have language in there that says, in the instance of force majeure, client agrees that they are not entitled to any refund. Rather, the amount that they've paid to date will be used as a credit towards a future date, and that future date needs to be within X amount of time and is subject to vendor availability. And, if you are a vendor who ups your prices every year, making sure that that's in your contract, that, the money paid is now a credit towards future services, whatever those services may be. If it's not a wedding ceremony, maybe it's just a celebration. And, that you have some parameters around that as well for your business, so that you're not all of a sudden giving a credit for an event that's 5 years out.
Okay, Wynne, I do have a question, because this has happened to me recently with some clients.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about rescheduling fees or adding on additional fees for reschedules.
No.
I have found, and I totally understand why people do this. I have not done this yet, but I understand why people would. What I find interesting is when an initial contract doesn't mention any sort of rescheduling fee, and now that a reschedule is happening, vendors saying like, oh, and by the way, I have a fee. I think that's a little hard to swallow.
Mm-hmm.
Should the initial contract mention a rescheduling fee, or is it not necessary and like we can do whatever we want when it comes time to reschedule?
So that's a great question. So first of all, this idea of throwing in rescheduling fees and restrictions on when an event can be rescheduled to, if that's not in the original contract, there is very likely no chance that a court would uphold that, because you can't unilaterally change a contract without the other party's consent. You can't all of a sudden just start saying these extra terms apply. Now, yes to having it in your contract to begin with. Even in the instance of, an unexpected event like COVID, we still don't know whether or not that would actually be enforced. You're seeing a lot of pushback from clients saying, this isn't a standard situation in which we decided to change the date, or we decided that we were having to move. This is literally the entire world on lockdown, and it's unethical for you to enforce that. And so I am seeing most vendors choose not to enforce that. The areas where I think you could ask the client, again, and this is why you need an addendum, which is another one of your questions that you guys had pre-sent to me. But you could ask the client to accept additional fees that are going to be covering the new fixed expenses that you would not have otherwise anticipated having. So like if you're hiring a cleaning service to partner with to be there on the date of the wedding, and that cleaning person, you know, is going to be sanitizing every hour type of thing throughout the day. You know, maybe that's a $300, you know, fixed fee. I
am seeing that. I mean, and I feel like I'm such like, you know, a small spec because I'm invitation, so I'm not getting all this, but Kimberly's seeing all these contracts. But just talking to planners, I am seeing that people are like, now you need more, you need an attendant in the bathroom now to make sure that only so many people are going to the bathroom at this time, and just things like that the couple is having to pay for in the event of a wedding, and that was not an expected cost.
Right. And so that's where, you know, you can ask them if they will pay for that. But again, you can't really unilaterally say, now you have to pay for all of this. Like that is not something they expected. And so, you know, the profit margin on the event industry will be lower, I think, for this, you know, coming year, because a lot of people will have to eat those costs or, you know, put it in their COVID policies that they are implementing with the clients, that the client needs to now take on the responsibility of finding somebody to be that person. That's certainly a way that they could do it where that the vendor is not incurring an additional cost. But moving forward, for all of the contract revisions that are going to be happening now before anybody books any new clients, every wedding vendor that is listening, you need to do that. Revisit your contracts, you know, rewrite them, rethink them. But that is something where you can now add those in to your contracts. That if there are any additional, you know, fees that are incurred in order to enforce government regulations, whether it's state or federal, that the client will assume responsibility for those. I'm also telling people to contact their local stationers and to get, you know, I'm telling venues in particular to contact their local stationers and to get a great set of signage that they have for every event that says, you know, essentially warning before you come in, you're coming in at your own risk. Obviously there's legal writing for that, but putting those on the doors, and then also signage that they can put up, you know, on an actual stand.
If anybody needs signage, please email Annie at 5by7designs.com. Thank you.
I know. I'm like, you can make these and you could sell them as packages. But you know, where there's the flow from indoor to outdoor at some of these events, that you have this sign up that says, you know, at this point we are at capacity. Please stay outside until somebody exits. And then that's really important for venues to have.
Ugh.
So speaking of like warning signs or whatever,
Yeah.
I'm curious about like vendor liability for their team. So for example, if like I'm a planner and I will always have at least one assistant with me, do I need that person to sign some sort of like waiver of liability of like, if you get sick or you get COVID, you can't come after me for it? Do all of it, like photographers who have second shooters, do we need to have some sort of release of liability in particular with COVID?
Yes. Okay. So quickly before I get into that, the additional language that you're adding in, if it is being rescheduled, if it is a cancellation, if it is a credit, everything should be in an addendum, because you are effectively changing the terms of the original agreement. And so you should always have an addendum in place so that you can enforce the new terms of the agreement. Okay. On to your team. Yes, you definitely want to have waivers. So, and you can ask, you know, the lawyers who you're working with, you know, or I'm happy to talk with anybody as well. We've put together like COVID protection packages to try to keep costs really low for people. But there should be, you know, a waiver for everybody who's on your team that they sign, you know, talking about whether or not, there should actually be two waivers really, but one of them is that they're assuming the risk of working with you that day, especially in an event. If they're like running errands or doing some pre-planning, or they're at a meeting, you probably don't need it then, but the day of the event, I probably would have them sign that, especially an independent contractor. As far as the other waiver goes, and this is really to keep internally for you, but I would have them sign this before any type of event. So this is going to apply to rehearsal, dinner, brunch after the wedding, is that they're signing a waiver saying that they have not been exposed to anybody who has COVID to the best of their knowledge, and that they don't have COVID to the best of their knowledge. And, that they haven't been exposed in the last 15 days or whatever. And that's really for the purpose of, let's say that at an event, let's say grandma gets sick. And afterwards, they come back and they're like, well, nobody in our family could have done that to grandma. And, no guests would have, so it had to be a vendor. And they start looking at everybody. In that instance, you want to have something in your files that your people have signed, so that it shows that you took reasonable precaution in trying to ensure that nobody who was sick was there, because that will help protect you in the instance of a negligence claim. And on that note, for those waivers that are being signed, they need to be kept in a separate file than your standard personnel files. So you have a personnel file that has everybody's contracts in it. If they've ever received any written warnings, if they've received words of accolade, like anything like that would go in a regular personnel file. Their tax documents. Anything related to medical needs to be in a separate file that is titled confidential. And it's only to be looked at by whomever truly needs to look at it. So it's probably just you as the owner of the business. But I would, yes, have those waivers signed.
Okay. So like for me as a planner, that I would have the people on my team signing this. Do I also need all the other vendors to sign it for my company? Just, you know what I'm saying? Like, do I need a photographer and their assistant and videographer and their assistant and everyone in the band?
Under different contracts with the...
Right. They've contracted with the client directly.
I think that So I received that question the other day from a venue. And I think that the venue probably would like a waiver, probably should have a waiver with every vendor that comes on premises, saying kind of that same thing, that you don't have, I had actually made a note somewhere that I was going to add that and send it to everybody who's already got a package, because I think it's a really good point. It's that, your team is adhering to whatever the government regulations are, in your local area, and that they're assuming full responsibility if they bring somebody on site who has COVID and, or, is proven to have COVID, and that there's backlash on the venue for that. I think vendor to vendor is a little less likely, because a client is likely to sue each vendor independently. But since the venue is housing everybody and the venue is already taking precaution to tell the guests, if you have, if you have symptoms, don't come on premises, that the venue probably wants to make sure that they are also having that conversation with the vendors that they're having on site.
Who would be liable if someone got COVID at an event? Would it be the venue, or would it be the client, who is having the event?
So it's a really great question. First of all, it's probably going to depend on back to the person who actually had COVID and gave it to other people.
Can you sue that person? I don't know.
If they knowingly and willfully came to a public event, knowing that when they had symptoms, were symptomatic or had COVID, and that they knew it, then you probably could. Honestly, yeah, you probably could. It would be crazy, but I think there are different ways that you could go about that. But it has to be knowing and willful. So that's where it kind of gets a little bit tricky. Is does somebody know they do, or is it allergy?
Yeah. Most people are not showing up to an event sick.
Right. So, that's kind of where that comes into play. I am telling all vendors that they should have language in their contract, a clause that the client is assuming full responsibility for vendors' legal fees if the client chooses to continue to host event during this time, which is the time of a pandemic, because the vendor could get sued. I mean, realistically, if I'm representing somebody whose grandma got COVID at an event and died, okay, or let's say a parent gets COVID and died, and the reason why I changed that is just has to do with the life expectancy involved when it comes into damages. Okay, so let's say parent gets COVID and dies. It's going to be really hard to trace who actually gave them COVID, but I'm probably going to go after the venue and any vendor who allowed this event to go forward without taking the precautions that are in your state's executive order. So like Minnesota has, an executive order in place that has signage requirements for communal spaces, wherever that communal space is, which in an entertainment venue, there's communal spaces, right? So you've got to have those signages. If they didn't have them, there's negligence there. If you were a vendor and you knowingly allowed the event to continue despite the regulations that were in place, I probably would also go after them too, because you are facilitating allowing this to happen. And then, of course, the hosts and anybody who you could find. And the reason why you're going to go after them is because it's going to be really hard to figure out who has it, and you're emotional and you want answers, right? Like, this is supposed to be the happiest day of your life, and now all of a sudden forever it's going to be associated with your parent dying. And that's a pretty big, that's heavy. That is a heavy burden. And whether or not, you would legally end up winning a case like that, which I think that a lot of COVID contraction cases are going to be really difficult to win, because the other side of that argument is you're assuming the risk that you're going to get COVID if you're going to an event. I mean, it's all over the news. You can't not know that going to an event is risky.
Right.
So I think it would be tough to win. But if you have somebody who is just devastated and heartbroken on the other side, and they have a lawyer who's willing to take it on, I mean, you could end up in, a year to 3 years of a legal battle just to not, lose that case, but, to win your case and to say, no, I'm not responsible. But there you are with $150,000 in legal fees. So that's where I think it's really important to have that language.
Well, and I think to your point about going to court, I feel like I've heard of a lot of vendors who have had clients who have pushed back on the non-refundable deposit. And, like you're saying, they're like, I get it if we were just changing the date. I get it if we were canceling the wedding, but this is a world pandemic. It shouldn't apply. And even though the vendor might have a solid contract, it's like, can I afford to fight it? Yeah.
That deposit is probably a lot less than the legal fees are going to be. So
right.
May as well.
Right.
But you also don't want your clients to bully you into that. It's a hard,
and that's what sucks. I mean, I feel like a client could easily bully you into it, because you're like, what am I going to risk all of this money to maybe keep that $6,000 deposit?
And that is a really hard part. Like being a lawyer who represents so many vendors, it's really hard to have that conversation with them to say, look, I know you're right. Like, I absolutely know that you are right, but your deposit was, $1,500, even at our super low rates for wedding vendors, you're still going to end up walking with nothing in your pocket if you win. Like, it just isn't financially worth it. Now, one thing that I think vendors can consider doing, you would want to check within your states, but it can happen in other states as well, like cross boundaries. So a lot of times lawyers, we have people licensed in a number of states, but a lot of times, you have to find a lawyer who's licensed in your state to practice there. But with mediation, one thing that we have found to be pretty effective is offering to mediate a scenario. And so mediation, I should say, it's kind of like it's facilitated resolution. So you have somebody who's a neutral that you hire, and they kind of act as a judge, although they don't have the final say in mediation, but they kind of try to help you resolve the situation. So I actually am also a mediator. I can't mediate for many wedding vendors here in Minnesota because I work with all of them, but I have, talked with wedding vendors in other states. And a lot of mediators now are doing e-mediation. So for example, you could say, hey, we need an hour of time or 2 hours of time to try to resolve this. And so then what happens is I've got, one party in one conference room on my screen and one party in another conference room on my screen. And I go back and forth between the two, hearing the two sides and work to help facilitate a resolution there. In that instance, you're looking at maybe, a $300-400 investment versus thousands of dollars and a year of waiting time. I mean, with mediation, we could mediate next week. And that is something that I really, really encourage people to try. And that actually is also something that everybody should look for in their contracts. A lot of people will throw in arbitration. Arbitration is fine as well. I actually also am an arbitrator, but arbitration, in the instance, if you said, hey, Wynne, I've got an issue with a client and we need to come to a resolution, we're going to hire you as a mediator. Okay, then I try to help you come to a resolution, but my decision is not binding. So if I say, hey, this is what's going to happen, it's not binding. It's up to you guys to say, we're going to take it or leave it. We're going to continue to court. If you hire me to arbitrate a matter, I make the decision as to what happens. So I ultimately say, you can keep this money. You have to return this money. That's the final say.
So arbitration is more like you're the judge.
It's like court. Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually didn't really know what the difference was.
Yeah. So that's the difference. And we encourage a lot of times people to go the mediation route because arbitration is really hard to appeal. But anyway, that is a way that you can work with clients, especially clients who have a maybe heightened level of emotion and it's difficult to talk with them, or maybe you don't like confrontation. A lot of times you can save money and time if you go the route of mediation, which now is very much e-mediation based.
I have no, go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay. So what about vendors? Here in the U.S., we're all state by state. So every state has a different kind of set of guidelines. What if you are a vendor? I'm going to give a couple of different scenarios here. What if you're a vendor and you are, you're based in, let's say, Virginia, where we're a lot, tougher lockdown than we are in Texas, and you're a hair and makeup person, and you're contracted to fly down to Texas, but you have different laws in Virginia. Are you supposed to adhere to the laws in your state, or the laws of where the event is taking place?
So you would be adhering to the laws in the state where the event is taking place for the work that is associated with the event itself. Now, where that could run into an issue is if there are travel restrictions. So, for example, Maine has a restriction in place through, I think it's through late fall at this point, maybe through the end of the year, that if you fly into Maine, you have to be quarantined for 14 days before you can attend a public event. So in that instance, now all of a sudden it's like, man, I was contracted to photograph this wedding in
Maine. I
Maine.
stay 14 days in a hotel, and who's paying for that?
Right. Exactly. And so in that instance, then you're not necessarily looking at impossibility, which is an argument that a lot of people are using to get out of a contract. But you're looking at impracticability, which is another argument. And you can use that. A vendor can use that to a client just as a client can to a vendor, where you're saying, look, I know that at face value, the law says this event can continue, but you are paying me $5,000 to come and shoot this wedding. And now you're also saying that in that state, I have to quarantine for 14 days, 14 days at a hotel that's a decent hotel. You know, you're not looking at less than probably $250 a night. You're spending an exorbitant amount of money. You're not making anything at all. And that would make the contract impracticable to perform.
Can a vendor, let's say like I hear makeup, even though events are taking place, can they cite not being comfortable with working an event right now? I mean, is that like, or like, let's say the vendor is a type 1 diabetic or autoimmune things, they do not feel comfortable being up in someone's face right now. Is that, do they have that right?
Yeah. How does that work?
Yes. So in the rescheduling addendum or in the just like COVID policy enforcement addendum, I'm making a note. Hang on one second, guys. Because that's another one I'm going to send out to anybody who's already gotten the package. So a COVID policy enforcement addendum, you want to include a clause that addresses safe working or COVID safety. And that's another clause that's kind of in the set of clauses that you would want to talk with your lawyer about, or feel free to contact us. Those are in that package as well. And that addresses that situation in particular, that if you are, at an event, or if you are going to go to an event and you feel as though, somebody there is symptomatic or making you uncomfortable, that you would have the right to leave if the client does not rectify the situation. So that really does protect in that type of scenario.
So then are you saying that I have a postponement addendum and a cancellation addendum, which I did not have back in February, but I do now.
Yes.
Do I also need a COVID addendum for events that are planned to move forward?
Yeah, I would. And so I've actually been working on one for Minnesota that complies with kind of the Minnesota regulations as they currently stand. And I would encourage to maybe have some people, and you guys could do it as well for Texas, but I would have one that is fairly consistent across the industry, that essentially kind of says, your event is moving forward. Here is a document that shows our COVID policies and procedures. Here are the steps that we are taking as a vendor. And, here is what we expect of you as a client if you are choosing to move forward with an event during this pandemic. And it's not really putting any more burden on the client necessarily. Like, it's not asking them to pay any more money. It's not asking them to, contract any more people. But it is saying, here are the steps that we are taking to protect you. Here are the steps we expect you to take to protect us. We're thrilled to, still be able to execute your event. We know that it's going to be a fantastic day. Glad that we're all in this together. Here you go. And I do think that is important, because you could end up in a situation where, you do have, father of the groom who is, is symptomatic, and you are very uncomfortable, and they're saying, no, it's allergies. But you're in your head and you're like, I don't know if it's allergies. I don't know if you're lying to me. I see that you're sweating and you're coughing, and it's freaking me out because I have and that is a scenario in which you want to be able to say, I need you to fix this. Otherwise, I do have to leave because, I am not going to put my life on the line for this day, essentially.
Mm.
And there's mutual expectations,
Right.
they expect the same out of vendors, and vendors would expect the same out of clients. And again, you're not unduly burdening them. You're not adding anything.
So death to his part
their
does not
plate.
include your vendor team,
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I would do that.
Ugh.
And is that something that, just like your postponement and cancellation addendums should be drafted by an attorney, is this something that also should be drafted by an attorney?
I would. The issue right now that we're seeing, and it really sucks, but for non-attorneys, to be honest, but people are hanging on every single word right now of any communication, if it is email, if it is a tweet, if it is an Instagram post. And so you can go ahead. I mean, I guess it depends on how your attorney works. But a lot of the times my clients will draft something and then they'll send it to me to just review it and make sure that it's okay. And I think their goal in doing that is, that they're saving some money because they're not paying an attorney to draft it. But I would at least have it reviewed and approved by an attorney before it goes out, so that you don't end up inadvertently committing yourself to something or opening up liability.
And is this also something that you can purchase with a template? You know what I mean? Like a template draft of this to incorporate? Is this something I can buy from you as a template with?
Yeah, you can. Yes, you could buy it from me as a template. Absolutely. So a lot of the times, this is, and I will say, just because, I touched earlier on kind of the sites that sell forms in general. And, people ask us all the time, will you just sell forms? Will you please just sell forms? We can't. I've had many conversations with judges about this because we do get so many requests, and we have just been advised that doing that as an attorney really opens yourself up to a lot of liability as it relates to your professional rules. With that said, we have templates that we've created internally that we can work off of to sell to a client, but we just also provide them with the guidance and legal consult with it. So it's you're actually working with an attorney rather than saying, I'm buying a form and then I'll go hire an attorney to look at it. So that is the difference. But yes, we certainly can do that. Yeah.
Good.
I didn't know I needed this form, but it sounds like I do.
Does it matter when, you being in Minnesota, can you help somebody in a different state with their contract?
Yep. So depending on what state it is in. So I actually am personally licensed in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. And then we have attorneys that we work with for state compliance in at least a dozen other states.
Okay.
And Texas is one, Colorado is one, California, New York. Yeah.
Good.
Wynne, before we wrap up, is there any other big takeaways you think wedding vendors need to hear?
Make sure that you have insurance in place and go and revisit your insurance policy. At this point, I would talk with your insurance provider and just say, is there anything else we should be adding? I've spoken with a number of insurance providers at this point, and there are pandemic add-ons that you can put onto your policy at this point. So I would ask them about that. The question of whether or not an insurance company will actually pay out is debatable, but I still would look into that. And then when you do have clients who are getting heated or who are pushing back, obviously you're going to try to respond to them before you suggest mediation. In that instance, I would just really encourage people to, read what they're saying, digest it, write out your response, but then step away for, 12 to 24 hours, and then go back and edit, because there's a good chance that whatever you say can end up on the internet, and you just you're thinking about future clients and what it will look like from a sales perspective. And then also just don't be afraid to contact a lawyer, honestly. Find a lawyer you like, who you can talk with regularly, and have them there. That's the point. You can find lawyers out there who aren't going to cost you an arm and a leg every time you have a question. And during this time, businesses are so vulnerable, the wedding industry in particular, because emotions are incredibly high. And potential damages are much higher than in most other industries. And so I think it feels like everything has to be done immediately, but take the time that you can to process what you're doing and make intentional decisions, because it will absolutely benefit your business in the long run.
That is all good advice. And when you have agreed to join us in our Facebook group to talk more about this, so access to the Facebook group is super easy. It is just by supporting our Patreon. You can go to thisweekinweddings.com/support, and we will have Wynne live with us to answer questions related to contracts and pandemics and addendums and all of the things. So thisweekinweddings.com/support. You can join us live with Wynne. Wynne, thank you.
And Wynne, thank you for making contracts interesting. At least, that's one upside of this market,
Yes. Well, thank you guys so much. It's been a true pleasure.
Oh, there's a lot to learn. I have to go back and reread all that your advice about rereading your contracts every year, every 2 years. I have not done that until Corona.
Yes.
Thank you so
Wonderful.
much. Thank you.
Thank you guys.